And welcome back to the Glenn Gerberg Weather and Climate Summit. I'm Dave Jones, CEO of Storm Center Communications. We're here at Breckenridge, Colorado with a live stream and our second presenter for today, Thursday. And that presenter is Dr. Ben Preston. Ben has been at DOE's Oak Ridge National Lab and has some fascinating things to talk about with regard to resilience, the energy grid, extreme weather, all that sort of stuff. And so I'd like to give you a little background of the Climate Change Science Institute at Oak Ridge National Lab to show you a little bit about what they do there along with the lab itself. So take a look at this video and then we'll start with Ben Preston.
Welcome to the Climate Change Science Institute at Oak Ridge National Lab. A big focus of the lab is to improve the way society makes decisions about energy and water use, including doing things like building an integrated building and car system that can be printed on a 3D printer and put anywhere in the world. For the Climate Institute, we're quite fortunate to be here at Oak Ridge because we can bring together the scientific experts and the tools to build climate models that can advance the science as well as operate at scales for decision makers. Since most of us experience climate as extreme weather events like drought, floods, and hurricanes, we run these models on one of the fastest supercomputers in the world to examine how these extremes may change over the next 50 to 100 years and what we can do about that. This is important because over the last 100 years, the Earth has warmed by about 1 degree centigrade. That's a rate that's 10 times faster than any rate in the last 800,000 years. So how sensitive human and natural ecosystems respond to these rapid changes is important, as well as the role of human activities in these changes. Here are some of our scientists to tell you a little bit more about the Institute.
The Institute was founded in 2009, really with the goal of trying to transform the way we do climate change research here at Oak Ridge National Laboratory.
Where we have more drought, where we have more powerful hurricanes, more electrical outages from grid disruptions, where the dense populations are relative to where intense hurricanes may fall in the future, we need to understand how climate change will affect our lives.
The best climate model we can make is one that incorporates as much as we know about the Earth system and resolving it on very fine scales, individual thunderstorms all the way up to the global climate. And that's why we need a big team of scientists to develop them and make them run on these big supercomputers that we use. We need those global climate models to faithfully represent everything that we need to understand.
Here at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, we have a long history of long-term, large-scale experiments. And we measure things that we can see above ground, but also things that we can't see that are beneath our feet. The intricacies of plant roots and soil microbes and carbon stored in the soil over long time periods. So we think about what the models might need to better project the future.
Our role in working with the Climate Change Science Institute is working with staff. Being able to take their analysis and their decadal models and utilize that for planning purposes as we start to look and plan for the future resilient electric grid. Monitoring, modeling, and then having a wide situational awareness across the entire energy infrastructure. That can have a significant impact within our planning to help us be better prepared for whether it's drought or understanding that there's going to be more hurricanes coming through. So this information will help reduce that uncertainty.
Increasingly, I think that's going to be how the risks of climate change are going to be managed, is building these connections between those doing the research and have the research tools, but further developing those and making them increasingly relevant to ecosystem services that are important to society and societal well-being, things like agriculture and water resources, energy systems, critical infrastructure.
System managers and risk managers at insurance companies, utilities, water utilities, electrical utilities, airlines, they're asking for more and more tools to help them understand the risks that they face so that they can more powerfully manage those risks and be prepared for the consequences, make adjustments in their business planning. And so we're developing a new extreme events data portal so that analysts can actually study trends in extreme events over time and document the impacts of those extreme events. We want this portal to help stakeholders, government decision makers as well, who need to develop policies to make the country more resilient to extreme events.
Here at the Institute, we've made great strides in understanding the climate system, and we look forward to using this information to help society become less vulnerable to climate change. So if you're interested in this, come join us.
Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending upon where you are in the U.S. or in the world. It's my pleasure to be here. It's my first time attending this summit. I'd have to say there are worse places in the world than Breckenridge to have to attend a meeting. So the video you just saw sort of gave an overview of the type of research and the broad diversity of research that we do at Oak Ridge National Laboratory that's focused on sort of the issue of climate change writ large. And one of the advantages of being at the lab is we have this sort of critical mass of research personnel, as you heard, over 100 people sort of working on climate change. And we also have some nice infrastructure and some nice toys like the Titan supercomputer, among others. But the real challenge for us within the Institute at this moment in time is how do we take all of that sort of critical mass, those large investments in people and infrastructure, and make them increasingly useful to those out there who are actually having to make decisions over different spatial scales, over different time scales, about how to manage not only sort of long-term changes in the climate system, but also just the climate, weather, and extreme events that we experience on a regular basis, including this week here in the U.S. So first, a confession. So I'm not a meteorologist. I'm not a climatologist. Technically, I was trained as a biologist and environmental sort of risk assessor. So I basically deal in carnage, so telling people about the myriad ways in which climate variability and climate change had adverse effects, particularly on societal systems. So today I'm talking mainly focusing on the energy sector and the energy system. You know, working for Department of Energy Laboratory, we do have an interest in the energy system, but I also work across a broad range of areas looking at infrastructure, the built environment, how changes in population and development influence our exposure to extreme weather events and consequences that arise, and I also do a lot of work on thinking about adaptation. So how do we adapt to the changes in the climate we've already experienced or what we're likely to experience years, decades going into the future. So for today, in terms of an outline, I want to talk sort of briefly, sort of setting up, talking about energy as a climate vulnerable sector. And then for fun, we're going to do sort of a virtual field trip. So I'm going to talk about some of the events, extreme events I experienced while living for a number of years in Australia and doing work down there with the CSIRO. As a bit of a fun way, a quote-unquote fun way of talking about some fairly nasty events and the implications they had for the energy sector down there. And then I'll bring it back to the U.S. and do sort of a systematic overview of the various ways in which there are these linkages between what happens with the energy sector and what's happening with weather and climate. I don't want to talk just about doom and gloom, so I want to also talk about some of the technological developments we're pursuing at Oak Ridge on an R&D perspective to help us modernize, particularly the electricity grid, and understand what's happening with it in real time. And then I'll say some words about sort of looking sort of longer term in the future, thinking about not only climate change, but technological change, population growth, and how we deal with that in terms of making planning decisions. So that's where we're headed in the time that we have, which is fairly substantial, I hope. Okay, so energy. So in terms of setting this up, so from my perspective, you know, I talk about energy as being sort of the other vulnerable sector. And so I've worked, you know, the past 15 years mainly on the issue of climate change. And quite often when we think about energy in the context of climate change, energy is the culprit, right? It's the driver. It's greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector or energy consumption that are driving changes in the climate system. And we think about consequences of climate change to agriculture, to water resources, sort of property damage and loss from sea level rise or big storms, or the effects of extreme heat events on human health. But it turns out the energy system is also one of these sectors that's critically important, but also sort of changes and is very sensitive to, or changes in lockstep with what's happening with weather and climate. It's a big sector. It accounts for about 6% of U.S. GDP, and it supports a whole raft of other infrastructure systems, from water pumping for water resources to telecommunications to transportation. So it plays a critically important role in society. And as we've seen, and as I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about, the energy sector is vulnerable to extremes of climate. So a sort of typology of ways in which extreme weather events sort of affect energy systems. We can talk about implications for energy supply. And, we can often conjure up these images of, an ice storm, trees fall down, that takes out the distribution lines to people's houses, and there's a power outage. Same with, say, a tropical storm or a hurricane. But we can also work upstream from that. So the whole energy supply chain is also vulnerable. Transmission lines, power generation, or even the extraction of fuel sources. So I'm going to give examples of all of that. There's also risk to energy demand. So a big concern around climate change is higher temperatures, and what does that mean for energy demands, whether it's summer cooling or winter heating. Risk of catastrophic failures, and that's sort of where we're gonna start this journey, is talking about what happens when you have these major failures of the energy system and the consequences that arise. And I'll say a few words about this issue of maladaptation, and this is sort of changes that we make in response to concerns about extreme weather events or concerns about climate change that can actually have adverse consequences, adverse externalities for society, the economy, and the example I'll show is potentially the energy sector. Okay, so our field trip, so we're headed down under to Australia. So I lived here from 2005 to 2010 in the city of Melbourne. Around 2009, after I've been living there for about 4 years, we went through this period of about a 2-week heat wave during the summer. So it was sort of late January through early February. So the figure there on the left sort of shows the minimum maximum temperatures over this 2-week period within the city of Melbourne. So sort of the middle of that first week, so this is January 28, 29, 30, sort of temperature shot up basically above 100 degrees Fahrenheit for about 3 days in a row. Melbourne in particular is used to a lot of variability in weather. There's even songs about Melbourne having 4 seasons in one day, and if you live there, you get to experience that. But 3 days above 100 is a fairly significant event. Then some temperatures drop back down to sort of a reasonable seasonal average, sort of low to upper 80s. And then on the February 7th, temperature shot up again and hit a record of about 113 degrees Fahrenheit. So over the course of this time period, there's a whole raft of consequences. So one, a number of heat-related deaths. And these weren't talked about that much because there were other consequences that arose that sort of overshadowed that, but something on the order of 200 to 400 excess deaths due to heat during this time period. Melbourne is actually notorious for failures of public transportation during extreme heat events. So the rail system kind of breaks down, you get buckling of tracks. There's this weird irony where above about 35 degrees Celsius, so once you get into the mid-90s, the air conditioning on trams and trains starts to cut out and stop working just when you need it the most. The power demands, when everybody switched on their air conditioning, put a lot of stress on the energy grid. And then that last day where you had this record high on February 7th became known as Black Saturday because high temperatures combined with really high northerly winds, which were in excess of 60 miles an hour, contributed to sort of catastrophic fire weather conditions. And that Friday night, I remember sitting at home and looking at the weather reports, and the big concern was, given the weather conditions that are anticipating on Saturday, this is the makings of a horrible, horrible fire weather day if we were to have a fire. And that's in fact what happened. And this is coming on the backs of about a 15-year period of drought. So the entire state of Victoria, southeastern Australia, have basically been baking and suffering from rainfall deficits for over a decade, which really primed the landscape. So Black Saturday became essentially the worst natural disaster in Australia's history, particularly in terms of loss of life. So there were 175 lives lost just due to the fire alone. There were multiple fires ringing the city of Melbourne. So we had building damages, livestock losses, economic losses, and years and years and years of litigation. And that day I remember being in Melbourne, and it was hot. But you had it was like standing in front of a sort of blast furnace, these really high winds blowing through the city, and the city was sort of yellow with this, bushfire smoke. So it was fairly surreal conditions. And what I want to do is just play this sort of video for you, which sort of recounts sort of one of the news reports from that day. If I can get this to...
More than 36 hours battling the worst bushfires in the country's history, exhausted crews were blessed with a welcome cool change last night, but it was no time to rest.
We've got major fires. There's 10 major fires in Victoria. We haven't tracked them. Those fires will take 3 or 4 days to get under control.
Across the state, once leafy suburban hamlets have been reduced to a smouldering wasteland.
Got nothing. It's all gone.
Where nothing remains but scorched earth, twisted tin and ash.
It was so ferocious. And I can understand how people got caught, and I can understand why so much has gone.
Those killed were trapped in their homes or incinerated in their cars as they tried to outrun the flames.
Some people that we know, I think they've lost 2 of their young kids, so that's even worse.
More than 750 homes were destroyed by the inferno.
And you've lost everything? Everything. Everything we own.
This couple took refuge in their cellar as the flames roared overhead.
See, as the house was burning, that the lid of the cellar, which was metal, was just glowing red in the corner, and I didn't know whether we were going to make it or not.
Almost nothing remains of the township of Marysville in the Yarra Valley.
It'll never be what it was. You can't replace old buildings and 100-year-old trees.
Kinglake was the hardest hit. Entire streets no longer exist. 21 residents perished, including veteran television newsreader Brian Naylor and his wife Maureen. The sheer scale of the disaster has grabbed headlines around the world.
Good afternoon. The worst bushfires in Australian history have now claimed the lives of at least 84 people.
Firefighters in southeastern Australia battling massive wildfires this morning.
British Prime Minister Gordon Brown called Mr Rudd offering help. The federal government has announced a $10 million assistance package and national appeal. Eligible adults will receive $1,000 and each affected child $400. Those who lost loved ones will receive $5,000 to help with funeral expenses.
Our thoughts and our prayers go out to each and every one of them as they now try and deal with this tragedy and recover from the damage which has occurred.
The hunt is on in earnest for those responsible.
We've been suspicious about this fire all along. Fire experts have given us advice that this fire, they believe, was lit.
Kim Avosabak, 7 News.
Okay, so that was what was happening sort of the day after Black Saturday. And I play that video sort of to emphasize the sort of severity of this, but also there's a sort of the teaser at the end, which is the suggestion that some of these fires were deliberately ignited, and that's actually fairly common among a lot of the bushfire events that happen in Australia and elsewhere. But it turned out the big culprit in 2 of the biggest fires that day were not arsonists, but it was essentially these catastrophic failures of electricity distribution, so the failure of energy infrastructure. So what I want to do, this one's fairly quick, another video. This is from several years down the road, but it sort of talks about the aftermath of some of the litigation that arose.
An Australian court has approved a record payout of nearly $500 million to survivors and families of the devastating 2009 Black Saturday bushfires, which killed 173 people. A class lawsuit of more than 5,000 people were brought against electricity provider AusNet Services and asset manager Utility Services after a Royal Commission found the most deadly of the fires was caused by an ageing AusNet power line. The company still faces another lawsuit for a different set of bushfires.
Okay, so essentially what happened in two of these fires was you had a power line. Power lines, when they get really hot, they tend to sag. In this case, there was basically a support line holding up the pole. The power line sagged enough to hit that support line. There was an arc, it ignited vegetation, boom, you had a fire. And this happened in two different locations. So in December of 2014, there was a payout of $500 million. And then last year, there was a second payout on the order of around $300 million. So you're looking at about $1 billion in liability payments and settlements arising from this fire that were having to be paid basically by electricity services companies. So that's just one example and a fairly significant one of how when electricity systems fail in combination with these sort of extreme weather events, disaster can strike. But some of the other ways in which sort of I remember sort of extreme events affecting the energy system. So back on the right there, so back in January 2007, there's big flooding events in Queensland, Australia, which is big mining territory, and particularly coal mines. So the Elsham mine in Queensland, which is that picture on the right, it's basically an open cut coal mine, filled up like a bathtub with water during a flooding event. It's probably on the order of, at the deepest point, probably we're talking hundreds of feet. There's actually some video online that just shows this raging water flowing through this dam. It took weeks to pump all the water out. You had freighters sitting in ports waiting to be filled up with coal because coal is one of Australia's biggest exports. And they were just sitting idle waiting for this thing to dry out. And then early in 2014, I was back down in Australia for a few months, and this image was happening. So this is at Hazelton Power Station. It's a power plant in sort of eastern Victoria. And power station's not on fire, but that fire you see in the foreground is essentially another coal mine that's located, sort of co-located with the power plant, and it was burning. And if you know anything about coal seam fires or coal mine fires, they're actually fairly tricky to put out. So this one, raged and raged for weeks and weeks. That one was actually caused, they believe, by a case of arson and a campfire and embers blowing into this particular area. But another example of how these type of extreme events affect energy resources, and they affect them at their source, right? And then this sort of question about maladaptation. So another interesting story. So I talked about this drought that southeastern Australia went through for 15 odd years, and it became a fairly dire situation for water resources for the city of Melbourne. So the state government decided we're going to invest in a desalination plant because there's a lot of concern about climate change, and what we were observing with respect to drought was consistent with what models were projecting over the longer term in terms of reduced rainfall and water availability. So they invested in a desalination plant. This is not uncommon. Essentially, every major city on the coast around Australia has invested in a desalination plant over the past decade. So this one was constructed. It was fairly controversial because they took over a fairly pristine piece of coastal land. It cost about $4 billion to construct, which is about an order of magnitude more than other desalination plants around the country had cost. There's a $1.8 million fee that's paid to the sort of construction company and operators every day, regardless of whether or not the plant is used. So this was completed in 2012. So since then, it has not been turned on, right? Because right after it was constructed, the drought ended, the rains returned to southeastern Australia, and that resource was no longer needed. So it's been sitting there for almost 4 years now and hasn't been used. When it is used, it consumes about 90 megawatts of energy because desalination is a fairly energy-intensive process. Now they put in a wind farm to help offset some of those energy demands, but the controversy was, well, we could have done a lot more with demand management, and it remains to be seen. 10, 20 years from now, we might be very pleased that that plant was actually constructed. But for the moment, it's an example of what many are calling a maladaptive response to drought conditions that has some significant energy implications if this thing were ever to be actually turned on. Okay, so that's the end of our field trip. Let's come back to the USA, and this is I'm sure you've all seen these sort of pictures of nighttime lights, and what's nice about this sort of allows you to visualize the U.S. energy system, at least in terms of electricity generation. But for every one of those clusters of lights, not only are you using electricity, but those tend to be population centers. You also have people driving automobiles and using automobile fuels as well. So it's an extensive system. Again, large capital investments in this particular infrastructure, all of which are vulnerable to varying degrees to extremes of climate. So the Department of Energy, about 3 years ago, put out a report that sort of summarized and synthesized what we know about the various points of vulnerability in the U.S. energy system. It was developed largely in the context of thinking about climate change. So this fed into the U.S. National Assessment of Climate Change. But much of our understanding of the consequences of climate change, particularly for society, is based upon what we've observed at present or in the recent past in terms of what's happened with extremes of weather. And so the report goes through and sort of catalogs sort of various ways in which the energy sector is vulnerable. So oil and gas exploration and production. So this goes back to climate changes in the Arctic, Arctic Ocean free of summer sea ice. What does that mean in terms of transportation, access to energy resources? I'm doing some other work right now that's part of an Arctic assessment. And I'm working on developing socioeconomic scenarios for the Arctic. So thinking about how sort of the economy and society of the Arctic might change going into the future. And a lot of that hinges upon what happens with global energy demand. So are we going to, is energy demand globally going to increase intensive exploration for energy resources in the Arctic, or are we going to see large-scale shifts to renewables or collapses of sort of oil and gas prices like we've seen recently that have at least postponed sort of profitable investment in extraction of those resources? So that's one area. Transportation of fuels. So when you break up rail lines, you put roads underwater, that interferes with distribution of fuels around the country. A big thing is the use of water for thermoelectric cooling, both in nuclear power plants, coal-fired power plants, natural gas plants. Hydropower generation obviously is water dependent. Bioenergy and biofuel production. This is essentially an agricultural crop used for energy. So it too is sensitive to climate and weather. And I'm doing work right now looking at growth and yields of different types of bioenergy feedstocks and how those might change going into the future in response to different climate model projections of changes in temperature and precipitation around the nation. Wind generation, solar generation, so those are renewable energy technologies, but wind generation is dependent upon wind, and winds might be changing in a changing climate. Solar generation is dependent upon solar energy, so cloud cover and those kinds of factors are important. The electricity grid, which is, again, often where we first experience sort of failures of the energy system, and then again also sort of talked about energy demand. So it's a useful sort of entry point for looking at the various ways in which the energy system is vulnerable to extremes. And it includes this type of map, which sort of captures, and it's got dozens and dozens of little tiny case studies of where an extreme weather event, a flood, a drought, a wildfire has disrupted electricity generation, electricity transmission around the nation. So, on to this topic of resilience. So, we're all familiar with Hurricane Katrina as well as Hurricane Rita and the sort of the whole raft of hurricanes that affected the U.S. Back in 2005. And I think in many ways this is sort of a wake-up call for the energy sector, in part because it hit a fairly infrastructure-rich part of the United States in the sense of the Gulf Coast. So both Hurricane and Rita, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita sort of tore through all of our sort of offshore oil and gas drilling facilities and platforms in the Gulf Coast and disrupted them. They disrupted oil refineries, including flooding oil refineries, disrupting pipelines, disrupted and damaged ports, which are important for imports and exports and transportation of fuels. Damaged and flooded power plants, so particularly Katrina flooded a number of power plants in Louisiana and Mississippi, some of which took quite a while to come back online. Tore up transmission lines as well as distribution lines. And I think an interesting point is it also really disrupted corporate management. So you have a lot of energy companies that are headquartered in, say, New Orleans, and not only were the headquarter buildings damaged, but all your staff are now homeless because all their all their homes are underwater, right? So it's a massive disruption across sort of the entire supply chain of a critical point of the U.S. energy system. So some quick statistics. So for Hurricane Katrina reduced oil production in the Gulf of Mexico by 1.3 million barrels per day. So that's about 90% of Gulf of Mexico production capacity. And also disrupted 8.3 billion cubic feet of natural gas production, which is about 83%. So you're basically turning off the spigot of oil and natural gas from the Gulf Coast to the rest of the United States. And so if you're interested in energy markets, energy trading, again, the distribution of oil and gas around the United States, that has ripple effects not only in the U.S. but overseas as well. So you see gas spikes around the country in response to these types of events. So even short-term disruptions of the supply chain have consequences. So in the wake of this, what we saw is particularly sort of progressive energy companies sort of saying, all right, one, this probably revealed our vulnerabilities to current extreme weather events. There's a lot of talk about future climate change, what's going to happen with hurricane frequency, hurricane intensity, a lot of uncertainty around what's going to happen going in the future, but a lot of concern. And so the progressive energy companies were thinking, not only how do we make our own companies more resilient in the face of these types of extreme events, how do we make our communities more resilient? Because if you're an energy utility generating electricity and you're selling that electricity on the market, which is going out to your customers, but none of your customers can receive that electricity because all the distribution lines are down, then your plant is basically going to be idling. You're not going to be able to sell any electricity. So you saw this whole narrative around resilience, particularly companies like Entergy were going out and doing work, sort of assessing risk to their assets or the broader community assets in response to climate variability and climate change. And I would actually say that sort of conversation, that introspection, that critical analysis was a bit infectious. So I think this was sort of the starting point for a lot of our sort of national and now international discussions around resilience, corporate resilience, community resilience, and how do we build that in. It's analogous to our discussion on adaptation to a changing climate, but in some ways can be treated somewhat independently depending upon the time scale. And I think Hurricane Sandy just sort of galvanized this thinking around the United States. So in some ways we have, the 2005 events, 10 years ago to thank for our sort of current narratives around resilience. The question then becomes one of, are we actually becoming more resilient? And I see a budding question here on the front row. So,
oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So as an energy meteorologist, Mike Ventures, WSI Corporation, tropical cyclones heading for the Gulf of Mexico were extremely important after you saw the economic impacts in the energy markets from disruption, and we just spoke very nicely about. Recently, though, as Phil talked about yesterday, we've been very lucky. We haven't really had a landfalling strong hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, and I, as an energy meteorologist kind of new in the field, I hear a lot of folks talking about how hurricanes tracking to the Gulf aren't as important nowadays as they were then, because our infrastructure wasn't as set up as it is today. Now I'm just wondering, is that just a misconcept in the field, thinking that these energy rigs or these oil rigs are much stronger nowadays, or is it more in the lines that, we haven't had a hurricane, so people aren't really caring about it much?
Well, that's a great question, and it leads me down another path. I mean, in terms of what's going to happen with hurricane frequency intensity on the Gulf Coast, I'm not even going to try to touch that. I think Phil, hit on that in his talk to some extent. On the complacency front, it's an interesting question. And yeah, I think that's a real phenomenon that happens both at the corporate level, happens a lot of places. And my experience working with local government in Sydney around extreme rainfall events, and somebody said, well, we haven't had a big rainfall event or a flood in 20 years, so that's not a problem anymore. And I think that's, from a risk management perspective, that's probably not a robust way to go unless you have a lot of confidence in your sort of long-term understanding of what's going to happen with the dynamics of those events. But it leads to another point, which is, so a lot of these energy utilities, the ones that have been working on, hardening their infrastructure. Okay, so if you've got a substation that flooded during Katrina or Rita, let's invest a little money, elevate that infrastructure so it's out of harm's way. If you had old utility poles that came down, you replace those. If you have ones that are weak, let's replace those, replace the wooden ones with the metal ones, et cetera. So a lot of investments are being made there. Some utilities would like to do more, but what this comes down to is, all right, we're going to invest X number of dollars next year in hardening our infrastructure and making it more resilient. Who pays for that? Consumer pays for that. So then you have to pass those costs on to the consumer. So you have to say, sorry, consumers, but you have to pay a little bit more in your electricity next year to pay for us making our infrastructure more resilient. Then the regulator steps in and says, well, hold on a second. State utility boards, state utility commissions who regulate those kinds of consumer prices step in and they say, well, what's your justification for making these investments in hardening your infrastructure? Because, hey, we haven't seen any of these big events in recent years. So one of the things that the Department of Energy is working on now in collaboration with energy utilities is how do you do the sort of cost-benefit assessment of these types of investments in infrastructure hardening and adaptation and resilience in order to justify that those expenses make sense and are in the interest of your consumers. And so that's, and if you're familiar with any type of the sort of planning and decision making around adaptation to climate change, how you do cost-benefit analysis for 30, 50 years into the future, given large uncertainties in what's going to happen, particularly with extreme weather events, it's a really tricky issue. So watch this space. Yeah,
just for curiosity's sake, I'm Phil Klotzbach from Colorado State. Just a quick question about the statistics in the bottom paragraph. How long a time period was that? Was that like a week or a month? Do you happen to know?
Yeah, so it was fairly transient. So production dropped off very rapidly. To some extent, it dropped off sort of in advance of the storms because everybody knew they were coming. But then sort of slowly sort of built back up. I couldn't tell you sort of, how long did these statistics last? Not very long, but you did have oil refineries that were under, a couple of meters of water, and some of those were offline for a month or 2 months. And so you're losing production at those facilities. You could offset that to some extent by production at other facilities, but it took a while to get a lot of this infrastructure back up and running at capacity. Okay, so moving on from there, so these are some of the images we saw again. So oil refineries underwater, drilling platforms sort of washing up on the Gulf Coast. So that one's probably not going back into operation. Power plants underwater, and then you had a whole bunch of folks, linemen working overtime, fixing up the distribution line, but also you saw big transmission towers coming down during these storms as well. And I want to come back. I'm going to come back later to talk about some of the work we're doing in terms of this question about the cost-benefit analysis around sort of energy infrastructure. But so that's the sort of pictures that we were left with. In addition, that's just for the energy sector, in addition to all the other sort of social and economic impacts of Katrina in particular in the New Orleans and Mississippi areas.
Okay, so water is a big issue for the energy sector. So both drought and flooding is important. Power plants need a lot of water for cooling. So as a result, we tend to site power plants next to large bodies of water, such as rivers, in order to have access to that cooling water. Most of that water gets returned back into the system, so it's not necessarily being consumed, but it is being used, and it's an important factor. So water flow is an important factor influencing capacity. So the other aspect of electricity generation and use of water is, you use water as to cool the power plant and electricity generation. You pump that water back into the river system. It tends to be at a warmer temperature. And the US EPA sets limits on what the water temperature can be in the receiving waters of power plants, because if the water gets too warm, that has adverse impacts for ecological life, fish and other critters living in our ecosystems. So the availability of water is an important issue, but also the quality of water is an important issue. So if temperatures rise in the future to the point where receiving waters for power plants are already sort of up against that threshold, that regulatory threshold, and then you have a heat wave that comes along, there's big concerns that that could actually have effect, and you have to sort of derate or limit production from your power plant in order to reduce the amount of water that you're using, and therefore the amount of water that you're discharging into the system. So what we're seeing right now in the Southwest, so that's Hoover Dam. You guys have all seen these pictures of reservoirs in the Southwest sort of going dry. So Hoover Dam has been in operation for many, many decades. So its capacity in terms of hydropower generation is off by about 25% since 2000. They have installed new turbines at the dam that allow it to sort of maintain capacity despite the lower water levels. But a 25% decline in generation is nothing to blow your nose at. We've seen, and that's sort of a persistent issue facing the Southwest right now. We see similar types of factors affecting other power plants around the country in response to more transient droughts. But then the other thing we have to deal with is floods. So this is just one example from Fort Calhoun Power Station in Nebraska during 2011. So that winter it was sort of we had a bumper crop of snow. And then spring came along and quite quickly, and temperatures rose quite quickly. So you had this massive snow melt, massive runoff, led to flooding in the Midwest, flooding along the Missouri River, where this particular nuclear power station is located. And so I've got a video here that sort of summarizes what was going on at that station.
You're looking at a nuclear plant manager in crisis mode. Tim Nellenbach is scouring every inch of this place, looking for where the next breach might occur.
We monitor it on an hourly basis to ensure that the conditions don't get worse.
At the flooded Fort Calhoun plant, that's a big job. For weeks, floodwaters from the Missouri River have engulfed this facility. When we get inside access at Fort Calhoun, we see where they had a recent emergency. This is the aqua berm that got punctured on Sunday, leading to some more of the problems here, letting some more of these floodwaters in, crucially close to the reactor. We're told the key buildings are secure, that there's no threat to public safety, but confidence can turn with one shift of the current. The biggest worry at the moment, maintaining electrical power. This is a key area right here. This is a transformer that actually helps to power the pumps that cool the reactor, that cool the spent fuel rods. They're pumping floodwaters out of that area right now to try to maintain it, but look how close the floodwaters are getting. Officials here say they have backups if the floods knock out these transformers. But if the backup systems don't work, this is what could be affected. Through closed-circuit cameras, we see the reactor core and the area where the spent fuel rods are kept. Officials say they're safe now. But if they overheat, could a catastrophic event half a world away be repeated?
People see floodwater all around. They think, oh no, it's another Fukushima. Is it another Fukushima?
No, it is not another Fukushima.
The main differences is the rapid flooding that occurred at Fukushima. This was a predicted event to a degree from the Corps of Engineers. The floodwaters at Fort Calhoun are outside the plant. There's no water inside the plant.
Okay, so that was not another Fukushima. The plant did actually lose electricity for a while, which is, it's a bit embarrassing. So you got a nuclear power plant generating electricity, and it loses its own power. And when that happens, that sets off a lot of alarm bells at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Backup generators kicked in, so they're able to maintain cooling. A fire broke out, which set off more alarm bells. That got under control. Now, the good news is that this plant was already offline. They'd taken it offline to refuel, but there's big concern about all the spent fuel that's already inside. And as a result, this plant stayed offline for about 3 years while they sort of implemented more sort of hazard mitigation measures to protect against flooding and increased precautions around protection of these types of power plants going in the future. And again, this had reverberations sort of throughout sort of Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And so one of the things that we're doing right now at the laboratory is looking at the sort of metrics that are used by the NRC in terms of siting nuclear power plants and judging their ability to weather these kinds of events. So familiar with probable maximum flood and probable maximum precipitation. These are sort of metrics of extreme, very different from a 1 in 100 year flood event, which is based upon statistical observations. So probable maximum precipitation and flood is effectively the theoretical maximum amount of rainfall that could be generated by the atmosphere over a given unit of time. So it tends to be far more conservative than a 1 in 100 year event, a 1 in 500 year event, because it's not based on observations, it's just based upon theories. And so what we're actually doing right now for NRC is doing work to sort of revisit how those numbers are calculated, updating them with more recent data, because the data they use to make those calculations is fairly dated, not counting for more recent observations. And this is just a sort of constant quality assurance, quality control that goes on, particularly with nuclear power facilities. They tend to be managed relatively conservatively for obvious reasons, in order to make sure that the methods they're using to site and protect these facilities are up to date and valid and sound in order to prevent these type of events going into the future. This is just one example. There was another power plant on the Missouri River in Nebraska that experienced similar close calls with flooding that same summer. Okay, so now I want to spend some time sort of drilling down into the electricity grid itself. And so this is a schematic of the basics of electricity grid, which most of us are familiar with. This is about the extent of my understanding of the electricity grid. So you have a generation station that's generating electricity. There's a transformer that sends that electricity into these sort of big transmission lines that carry electricity over large distances. And then somewhere you have a substation that steps that the electricity down and enters the distribution system, which transmits electricity to individual houses or different industrial facilities depending upon their electricity demands. At Oak Ridge, we actually own our own electricity distribution system, which allows us to do real-time experiments with different types of technology and configurations. So that's kind of handy. And that's because part of the reason why Oak Ridge was sited where it was during World War II was because of the Tennessee Valley Authority and access to large amounts of cheap electricity. So at one point during the uranium enrichment process, I think Oak Ridge was consuming something like 10 or 20% of the entire U.S. electricity production in the United States. And now we use that electricity not for uranium enrichment, but to run supercomputers, which also tend to be fairly electricity intensive. But so that's a distribution system. That's sort of what the grid kind of looks like. And if we look just at the cost of extreme weather events to the U.S. electricity grid, here's some estimates from EIA going back over about a decade. And we see impacts on the order of about 10 to up to $70 billion per year, every year, to the electricity grid. So these are sort of economic impacts that are sort of the size of a major hurricane making landfall, but these impacts are all borne by a relatively small sector, the energy sector that's sort of responsible for cleaning up after these types of events. So, you're talking about billions upon billions of dollars of investment each and every year simply to maintain and repair the grid in response to disruptions. Now, this is an interesting figure. So what this shows is essentially this is sort of an electricity grid investment curve. It's focusing just on construction of transmission lines in the U.S. going back to the 1960s. And so what you see is we sort of had the heydays in the 60s and early 70s of new transmission line development. And then that sort of, declined over the subsequent decades until around 2000, where it sort of hit this sort of plateau of low investment in new transmission. And I think it's rather interesting because I would argue that this sort of curve resembles a lot of our investments in infrastructure around the United States. I think if you looked at the U.S. highway system, we'd see something similar. So, post-World War II, we built the interstate system, so 50s, 60s, large investments in highway construction, and then that sort of, trailed off subsequently. So now we're just trying to figure out how to pay for potholes that we have to repair in our existing infrastructure. I think if you look at water infrastructure, sewage, water treatment, probably follows a similar trajectory. So we sort of bottom out over the past decade, and essentially what's been happening is a lot of the infrastructure has just simply been depreciating. And so now we have this task of some of the stuff is ending its lifespan or already has, and now we're having to reinvest. And so looking out into the future, we're basically anticipating that we're going to have to start making new investments in electricity transmission, distribution, generation around the country, along with all of our other infrastructure systems, assuming we have resources available to do that. So the big question is are we about to see a sort of resurgence in investment and development of energy infrastructure around the United States? And if so, where's that investment capital going to come from, and how much is going to be public versus private investment? So one of the worrying trends that we've seen in terms of the grid is that electricity outages around the United States have been trending upward. So the graph on the sort of the left there is just sort of the trend back to 2000 in electricity outages, major electricity outages around the country. And it's divided up, and this is just due to weather events, and it's sort of divided up into different types of weather events. But the increase in the trend is basically due to everything. So we're seeing increased outages due to thunderstorms and tornadoes, due to winter storms, due to hurricanes. So across the board, extreme weather writ large is driving the sort of increase in electricity outages. And as I've already shown you, electricity outages are associated with large dollar values in terms of their cost to society and electricity utilities. Now, what's driving that trend? Hard to say. Is this a reflection of increases in extreme weather events that are just having these impacts on the electricity grid? Is it a symptom of the depreciation of electricity infrastructure, so it's becoming more fragile? That's hard to say, but yep.
Ben, Howard Bernstein, WUSA in Washington. Wouldn't it make more sense just to invest money and having everybody with a home generator or lithium-ion battery pack in the house for storage, or doing it so local that we don't have this grid that's at such exposure to the extreme events, so that we don't have these massive power outages or the politics involved and the investments in these systems going to not allow that to ever happen?
Yeah, so great question. So this is all about the sort of distributed energy versus centralized energy, right? And what are the various costs and benefits of those different options? I mean, I think one of the challenges with that is, the large capital investments that have already been made in the existing grid and the existing infrastructure. Okay, so that's one. But, there's a lot of opportunities for new development to think about more distributed energy, particularly in the form of renewables. One of the things that we're doing R&D on at the lab and DOE is interested in are these sort of micro nuclear power generators. So instead of having these big, massive nuclear power plants that are generating hundreds of megawatts of electricity, you got something that fits on the back of a semi-truck that are more portable.
Like the spacecraft ones?
Well, think about, aircraft carrier ones. So these modular reactors is essentially what they're called. So it's an interesting way of using nuclear energy in this more distributed fashion. So sort of keep your eye on that space. But then you have, and this question comes up all the time, is it more efficient to have these sort of centralized electricity generation, but then you're having to transport electricity over large distances and creating these vulnerabilities, or do you have many, many, many different points of failure, so you're getting large numbers of failures, but they're all very, very localized?
Yeah, but I think ultimately you would just know exactly what failed to be an easier fix.
Right. So I'm going to get into some of this stuff. So that issue of sort of knowing what's going on with electricity is a good question. But another thing to point out is, so these sort of electricity disruptions are actually tracked by the Department of Energy, by the Energy Information Administration. So you can go online and look at the sort of database of historical outages that have occurred around the country going back about a couple of decades, and these were updated very, very recently. And we can use this to illustrate a kind of challenge just in terms of data and how we use data around these events for resilience and risk management. So this figure here, what I've done is, so one, I looked in that database of electricity outages, and I pulled out this event. So this is an event on May 8th in 2005 in Texas that affected 243,000 customers, lost power. Okay, and in the database it says it was an extreme weather event, so a storm event. So you can say, okay, well, the weather event caused that. Can we look at sort of weather and climate data and pull that particular event and identify that event in those data? So I went into the North American Regional Reanalysis data set and looked for the May 8th, 2005 sort of convective precipitation. And sure enough, you see this sort of precipitation anomaly located over Texas. That's essentially that weather event, that weather front that caused that particular outage. So this becomes interesting, because what we like to know to do research on this is what are the types of extreme weather events that are occurring, and what's their likelihood of contributing to a particular type of outage, and what are the characteristics of a given storm in terms of winds or rainfall or lightning strikes that, or hail, on and on, that are associated with these types of outages. But herein we have a problem, right? So I can go into reanalysis data and pull out, information for any day going back through, multiple decades of reanalysis information. And you just pull down the NetCDF data and you can access that. But meanwhile, all our data on outages is in this sort of tabular format on the web. So how do I marry these two data sets together so I can look at this sort of co-location and correlation between these sort of weather anomalies within our weather and climate data and these sort of anomalies in terms of electricity generation, transmission, and outages. And it turns out that's a real pain to actually do because of this sort of incompatibility of our different data sets. So we've got thousands upon thousands of records of electricity outages, and it's very easy to call up the sort of weather information to try and compare those, but you have to get the data in this sort of compatible format. So I did this type of analysis for about 3 different types of big events, but I certainly wasn't going to go and try and do this by hand for thousands of events. But there's some opportunities there for harmonizing some of our data, making it more interoperable, so we can do these types of historical analysis. Because what we'd like to be able to do is then say, I have an Earth system model projection of daily weather conditions going years, decades into the future. And if I know the types of characteristics in weather events and anomalies that lead to outages, then I can do this sort of prognostic projections of where we might see outages around the country using that sort of projected time series, compare that with a baseline, and start to do some impact assessment of what does a changing climate mean in terms of the types of weather events associated with electricity outages. So big data challenge associated with integrating these different types of information. So energy demand. So let's go back to that. So again, associated with the energy to grid. So 2012 was a hot year. We saw a lot of maximum temperature records broken, including in Tennessee where we are. We saw a lot of drought conditions across sort of the southern United States, almost from coast to coast. And that had an impact on energy demand, which showed up in energy prices. So the left figure there just shows the sort of temperature anomalies across the United States. And might be hard to make out, but unless you're in the Deep South or the Pacific Northwest, you likely experience fairly substantial, anomalously high temperatures during the summer of 2012. And so on the right, what we're looking at is essentially electricity prices. So the top right figure just shows different sort of regional wholesale energy markets in the sort of the northeastern United States. So sort of each sort of individual state or state cluster is its own sort of wholesale electricity market. And the bottom figure just shows a time series of energy prices over a several-day period in mid-June when we saw some particularly high conditions particularly high temperature conditions in the mid-Atlantic. Okay, so what you're seeing is these are day-ahead prices. So what this basically is sort of bids on electricity for the next day. So people are anticipating what electricity demand is going to be tomorrow, and all the utilities are saying, okay, this is how much we're going to generate to meet that demand. And when you have large amounts of demand, it shows up in your electricity prices. So you see a couple of price spikes on the day-ahead prices, one on Wednesday and one on Thursday, in anticipation of particularly high demand due to high temperatures. And the black line along there shows sort of average price across one of those, the sort of mid-Atlantic wholesale market. And the other lines show prices in different subregions of that market. And what you see is when you have these energy peaks, you're getting different wholesale energy prices in different parts of the region. What that basically reflects is constraints on capacity. So there's congestion across the transmission line because electricity generators are concerned about the ability to either generate enough of electricity or get that electricity across the transmission network to where the demand is. So you get these price differentials and fluctuations, which have implications for what people are paying for electricity, but it's also this sort of indicator of strain on the energy system. So if you're involved in your electricity utility or a trader, or you're working the wholesale markets, these types of price fluctuations actually matter. Okay, so where are we in this grand story? Cool. All right. So that's like the doom and gloom. So I want to talk about sort of some of the stuff that's going on right now to sort of modernize the electricity grid. And so, again, we've got this infrastructure that we built mainly over the 20th century. We're now in the sort of 21st century. We're looking ahead, and there's lots of things we have to deal with, right? So extreme events are just one of them. We're having to deal with renewables. How do we integrate renewable energy technologies into our existing energy grid? Turns out it's a little bit tricky due to intermittent generation capacity, and we're still working on how to store electricity from things like wind and solar. We have emerging threats, so climate change fits into that, but the whole cybersecurity challenge fits into that as well. So there's lots of worrying things happening in terms of people hacking into power stations around the U.S. That is a threat we're having to deal with. And then there's a whole new services arena. So we have the Internet of Things. We're using electric and rechargeable vehicles are slowly sort of making their way onto the roads, but that means they're also making their way into the energy sector and the energy system. So one of the things we're doing in the lab is figuring out, how do we manage all of these different sort of emerging technologies, emerging threats, and thinking about what the grid should look like going into the future. So this is just sort of this cartoon of the different areas we're working in. And a big focus for us is situational awareness of the energy grid. And that's actually been a real big challenge. So it used to be when you had an electricity outage, and in many places it still is, when you have an electricity outage, the utility just sits there and doesn't know until someone calls up and says, hey, I don't have electricity. Now they can go online and enter a form that says, hey, we don't have electricity. But getting awareness of what's happening with the energy grid has been historically rather difficult. So we're playing around with all kinds of stuff. So we're looking at one big thing for us is sensors. So how do we use sensors, put sensors on everything, plug them in the internet so we can track what's going on where, for example, looking at building technologies, applying sensors to transmission and distribution lines so we can tell when they're heating up, we can tell when they're sagging, how much they're sagging, wireless vehicle charging, so we do a lot of work on autonomous vehicles, making rapid progress on autonomous vehicles. If those vehicles are going to be electric, can we charge those vehicles while they're still on the road as opposed to plugging them in a station when they reach their destination. Looking at how we move electricity along across the distribution and transmission grid in flexible ways that build sort of redundancy and resilience into the system. And a lot of just sort of monitoring so we can tell what's going on with the electricity grid. So I'm going to talk through some of these examples. So one of the tools we developed a number of years ago is called BIRDie, which stands for Visualizing Energy Resources Dynamically on Earth. And this project is basically hosted out of Oak Ridge, and it's essentially an operational system. And it came out of the blackouts in 2003, when you had folks from the White House were asking, what's going on with the electricity grid, what's going on with this power outage, and emergency responders were watching CNN and saying, well, CNN says the blackout's about this big and covering this area. So there's very little understanding of what's going on with the electricity grid at any given moment in time. So we developed this system which uses sort of a geospatial approach. What allows us to do is map all of our electricity infrastructure, both the power plants, the transmission lines. We take real live feeds from electricity utilities so we can tell, and service industries, so we can tell where electricity is flowing across the U.S. at any given moment in time. And what this allows us to do is sort of visualize in real time what's happening with the electricity grid. So when you have a hurricane that's about to make landfall in the United States, this sort of operational system can go in. It takes NOAA's projections of the path of the hurricane and projects where that hurricane is going to go, how many outages you're going to experience due to the path of that hurricane, and also projects how much time it's going to take to get all those customers back online. So you get sort of advanced warning for the energy grid, and both utilities and, well, the customers don't necessarily get access to the information, but to utilities about what's going to happen to the grid and how much effort is going to be needed to get it back online. And you can start to make estimates of where do you need to stage your repair teams so they can be in a reasonable place to access the areas that are going to sort of be ground zero for losses. So that's one of the things we're actually use sort of right now for situational awareness around extreme events. And after each event, we basically look at what actually happened and use that to improve the model projections of what's going to happen going into the future. The other neat little tool we developed in collaboration with the University of Tennessee is called GridEye. And what this is this little box featured there. And all you do is you take that box and you plug it into the wall in any kind of electricity power outlet. And if you have a whole network of these, which we do now across the United States, which is all those little red dots, This ensured real-time monitoring of sort of fluctuations in the electricity grid based upon what's happening across the grid at any given moment in time, and so sort of like allows you to sort of visualize quickly what's happening. So I can show you this video of a sort of disruption, an outage that occurred in southern Florida a number of years ago, and through the Grid-Eye network, we're able to sort of estimate what's happening and look at the reverberations of that outage across the electricity grid. So the sort of graph on the left is tracking the anomalies, and then boom, you hit the spike, and on the right you see this sort of spatial distribution of all these sort of fluctuation reverberations that are happening in the distribution of electricity across the grid in the eastern United States associated with that one individual event. And so, previously, if you're up in Minnesota and you have this sort of anomaly of fluctuation of transmission of electricity, you're sort of saying, what happened? And you wouldn't necessarily be able to tie that back to, oh, there was an outage 2,000 miles away in Florida that triggered that particular event. And now you can monitor all of this in real time. So when you have a sort of anomaly that arises in one part of the country, you can see what's going on elsewhere to sort of see where was the initial trigger point for that particular event. And the other thing we do, which is kind of fun, is using drones as a technology, again, to sort of monitor what's happening with electricity infrastructure, grid infrastructure. So we've got a fleet of different drones that we're playing around with, and they've got, again, all these different sensors on them. So they've got cameras, they can do visual inspections. We're putting infrared sensors on them. We're putting sensors to detect different types of chemical signatures. And you can fly these around, transmission lines, transformers, substations, power plants, in order to sort of get real-time information around what's going on. So particularly if you have an outage, this can help you go in and sort of monitor what's going on or help diagnose what the problem was without sending somebody out in a truck to wander the line. So all those types of tools start to interact to build a sort of portfolio of awareness of what's going on. Okay.
I just have a quick question.
Sure.
What is the cost differential between using drones instead of like a group of men for, to try to go out and look at it? Is there any? Or
Great question. I've got no idea. I can't. It sort of depends upon. There's things that a drone can do that a group of guys in a truck can't do, but the reverse is true as well. And so can't answer the question. First, you would think it would be cheaper depending upon certain types. If you're trying to do a visual inspection, it'd probably be easier just to send a drone and let it run down a line. But sometimes it helps to have human eyes on a problem. So it's a good question, and I don't really know. And I also don't know. A lot of this is still sort of experimental R&D phase, so how much is actually being deployed operationally in the field? Probably not so much. Okay, so it's sort of ending this, the last sort of component of this talk is sort of looking toward a longer term future and thinking about, more specifically the climate change question and its implications for the energy system. And there's two big ways it affects the energy system. So one is in terms of the policy and regulatory environment. So I did some work a few years ago going out talking to energy utilities about the impacts of climate change and what they're concerned about and what types of hazards are concerned and how they're managing those. And really sort of what they said was, well, what we're really concerned about is, carbon regulations, carbon prices. That's really going to affect, our game as opposed to sort of the impacts of climate change. And so the policy regulatory environment affects everything from fuel prices, carbon prices, rates of technological change. So once you start regulating things, you can drive technological innovation. And regulation, as we often hear, affects consumer prices for better or for worse. And then the flip side is how long-term changes in the climate system affect frequency, duration, intensity of extreme weather events, availability of water, water quality, damage to infrastructure, and public safety. And to some extent, utilities are sort of actively planning for these sort of longer term changes. Now, The planning horizon for utility is on the order for 20 or 30 years. So when you get a license to operate a power plant, that license is good for about 30 years. So there's a cutoff down the line in terms of how far looking into the future utilities are, but they are thinking over multiple decades. And one of the ways they do that is through what they call integrated resource plans. So every utility is sort of required to produce a plan which basically spells out what a utility is anticipating in terms of future electricity demand going into the future based upon population growth, existing technologies, as well as the supply of electricity. So what that utility is able to generate based upon existing generation technologies, retirement of capital stock. So a lot of power plants around the United States have been retiring coal-fired generation. So that's a loss of capacity. So that's being factored in. But they're also factoring in sort of new generation that's coming online. So if you're replacing coal with wind or solar or natural gas, then you're factoring in those new assets coming online going into the future. Then what they're looking for is a capacity gap between the demand that's anticipated and what they can generate with some reserve margin. And if there's a gap, then that plan has to figure out how they're going to fill that gap and when in the future that gap is going to occur and how do they plan to have assets in place to fill that. So that's a tool that's commonly used, but when you look at those plans, generally, they don't include consideration for the impacts of climate change and how that might affect the intensity or frequency of drought events or flood events that might affect generation. So what they do plan for, and so this is an example from Tennessee Valley Authority, they're using various different scenarios in their plan, different rates of population growth, energy consumption, but they also have a decarbonized future scenario, which is basically around, federal regulations around greenhouse gas emissions. And so under that scenario, that's going to affect what types of generation they're actually going to be using, when they're going to phase out certain types of generation, and what they're going to replace it with, and the cost of doing business. So, but there isn't a sort of catastrophic climate future scenario where they're planning for, having to write down generation capacity because climate change and increasing drought conditions is going to reduce cooling water availability. That said, the public consultation that's done as part of the development of these plans, energy stakeholders are often encouraging utilities to think about climate change and the consequences of climate change as something that utilities need to be considering. So there's sort of growing pressure for utilities to start pricing in climate change policy as well as climate change impacts in planning for the future. Okay, so where does climate information fit into this? And this comes back to sort of what we're interested in at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So we do a lot with Earth system modeling in collaboration with other national labs. So Department of Energy is now one of the leading science agencies in terms of developing next generation Earth system model capabilities to look at the future implications of climate change. And so this is an animation. This is actually now, it looks nice, but it's actually several years out of date. But this is a simulation from the Community Atmospheric Model. And it's a high resolution simulation, which is about 37 kilometer grid. And it's a historical run. If I can find my cursor. Here we go. And so this is going to run for a few days, and this is just atmospheric water vapor. And from this sort of mile-high view of the global scale, it's starting to look like, a simulation of weather conditions around the world. So we're getting atmospheric rivers being generated. We're getting spontaneous generation of tropical cyclones that we can watch as they sort of make landfall in different parts of the world. And it's a winter simulation, or North American winter simulation, which is why everything's showing up in the Indian Ocean rather than in the Atlantic. But for us, the sort of high-resolution global modeling is where we're headed. And at the moment, sort of the models we're currently developing across the National Lab system, which is called the Accelerated Climate Model for Energy, or ACME. What we're driving to is sort of 10-kilometer resolution global simulation, multi-decadal runs going into the future, to sort of, in part to address some of the biases associated with coarse resolution modeling, but also to start generating information that's actually useful for people on the ground, right? And so the big challenge we face with all of these things is needing to push forward in terms of the spatial resolution, which we're making progress on, the temporal resolution, and then it's simply the reliability of the information. So it's nice to have really pretty pictures and simulations of model output, but if people don't believe the results, then you're not going to get anybody making large-scale capital investments in infrastructure based upon the output, right? So in terms of, and you guys will know this stuff better than I do, but so in terms of sort of the long-term climate projections, we have this big tension in terms of capabilities. So if we're doing forecasting over daily, weekly, or seasonal timescales, then the sort of initial conditions is a big issue, and getting those right is a big issue, and we've talked about that over the past couple of days. If we're looking longer term, eventually get to the point where the initial conditions aren't really telling us anything about what's going to happen when we get to, a few years down the road to a few decades. When we start talking about the end of the century, hey, it's okay because greenhouse gases, our exogenous forcing becomes dominant. We're just interested in climatology, and then it becomes about sort of boundary conditions being forced by greenhouse gases, and we start to get better predictability, at least around climatology, or so the theory goes. That sweet spot of the sort of decadal time scale, 5, 10, 20 years out, which turns out is the planning horizon for many, many different organizations, including the energy sector utilities. That's where we're falling in this gap, where our initial conditions aren't really helping us very much, and we don't have a strong enough greenhouse gas force signal to really tell us much about what's going to happen with the climate system. And so that sort of time scale is a big challenge in terms of reliability. So, we've all, if you're paying attention to climate change, you've seen these kind of plots of what happens with different model projections of water availability in the future. So this is, we've got 12 different global Earth system models, projections of water availability in the 2030s. This is basically sort of runoff. And pick any spot on the map, and you'll find at least a couple of models that'll give you completely opposite results, right? So if you're an energy utility and you're trying to think about why should I be incorporating climate model projections of what's going to happen with water availability into my planning, given this amount of uncertainty, it's hard to deliver a satisfying answer. You can do ensemble projections, ensemble means, you can do probabilistic analyses, but for a lot of people what this means is lack of convergence in models means lack of fundamental understanding in the response of the climate system, and we need to do better if we expect people to start using this type of model output for certain types of decision making. In the interest of time, I think I'll end by talking about sort of what we're doing in Tennessee. So back to sort of where I started in the beginning, trying to make sort of our science capabilities useful. So we've had a collaboration going with Knoxville, Tennessee, where we're closely located to, for a couple of years now, and around this concept of a urban climate adaptation tool. And this is basically a tool designed to integrate disparate types of information on climate, environmental conditions, development, mainly focused around stormwater management, stormwater infrastructure, particularly where the city can make investments in green infrastructure to manage future runoff from extreme weather events that might be changing with a changing climate, as well as increased impervious surface due to development, because Knoxville is actually growing relatively rapidly. And there's lots of cities like Knoxville around the country. So these intermediate-sized cities of 250,000 to 500,000 people are all over the place. So what we've been doing with the city is trying to push climate model projections down to a scale that sort of makes sense for them. So we've taken an ensemble of Earth system models that are operating around 100 kilometer grid. We've done some dynamical downscaling with those, with a regional climate model to get them to sort of 4 kilometer grid. And that top right figure is that sort of output for mid-century for just daily precipitation. And then from that, we've done a statistical downscaling to get those results down to about a 1 kilometer grid using a historical gridded weather product. And down we get down to 1 kilometer, and it starts to look reasonable. We're capturing these orographic effects from the Smoky Mountains in East Tennessee, and it's hard to recognize where we are because this is one of those graphs that climate modelers produce that you pretty much have no idea where you are in the world when you look at them. But 1 kilometer is not bad. 1 kilometer grid is about the size of downtown Knoxville. But we get these trade-offs. So again, a nice looking output that someone working in city government can say, all right, and I can start to recognize weather conditions that make sense at the scale we're operating. But you've taken an ensemble of Earth system models that have inherent uncertainties. You downscale them using a weather model. That creates uncertainties. You downscale them again using a statistical process, introducing more uncertainty in the system. And so this issue of is this reliable and how do you use this information is sort of the next challenge we're trying to face. So how do you make use of this information in ways that are responsible given these sort of uncertainties that have been generated? And sort of lastly, how we then use that information is we can take sort of climate information, but we're integrating that with a whole bunch of different data layers, population, housing, impervious surface, land cover, tree canopy, solar insolation. There's topography stuff, so elevation, slope. And we're basically doing this sort of large-scale data integration, data fusion in order to prioritize, in this case, where we should invest in green infrastructure so the city can get the most bang for its buck. And what we're trying to do is take all of this modeling magic, leave it in the background, and give the folks in city government an app that they can use on an iPad that focuses on key inputs and key outputs without them having to understand everything in between. And so that's the sort of directions we're trying to head, trying to sort of expand this so we're not just focused on one particular concern, but cover a whole raft of different types of decision issues that decision makers in cities actually face. But we're trying to do this in a way that's helpful, but also credible, because if we lose the credibility fight or the usability fight, then we're not having a lot of impact out there in society. So I think that's it. So thanks. Having a good time. We'll probably do some questions from various folks or whatever. But yeah.
I'm sure we have a number of questions. I have a few as well. We can start, Craig, with you.
Sure. Craig Setzer from CBS in Miami. What, if any, type of modeling have you done for solar activity, such as like a Carrington flare event or something like that?
In terms of, say, consequences of solar activity or for space weather writ large to the energy grid? Yeah, so that's not something that doesn't fall. There's certain labs, I think perhaps NREL or some other labs work in that area of these sort of large-scale disruptions to the energy grid, telecommunications, et cetera. Not something in our wheelhouse at Oak Ridge, so I won't try and venture an answer. And I'll probably use that excuse for all the questions that come in.
Do a microphone. Matt?
What percentage of U.S. power is still generated by coal? And do you see a point in time when utility scale solar will really be an option, or at least a player in the big picture of power generation?
Yeah, so I don't have the statistics handy on coal generation. I want to say it's something on the order of 20-30%. It's significant, but falling. But these are all regional issues. So in terms of where you have coal production, where you're going to have large-scale solar production, it's definitely a sort of regional issue. And the big issue with solar right now is it going to be highly distributed, so everybody's got rooftop solar that's feeding into the grid, or are you going to have these sort of large-scale, centralized, big generation facilities? So do I foresee a time where we have both of those operating? Absolutely. Yeah, well, I think we're going to have both. So I think the interesting thing about the energy landscape is there's, to some extent, a sort of diversification of the energy portfolio, and these sort of distributed generation mechanisms allow you to do that. So we're seeing a lot of stuff happening with leasing of solar panels, for example, for rooftop solar in various markets around the U.S. But then there's lots of issues around affordability, regulations around that, who owns them, who maintains them, local policies around that encourage or discourage that type of activity. But then, yeah, I mean, obviously, there's big solar outfits out there that are interested in these sort of large-scale solar facilities, and the cost of solar PV is declined. I've been working on this for 15 years, come down quite substantially over that time period. So I definitely think you're going to see these large-scale deployment of both of these types of approaches. When? Hard to say. A lot of that depends on what's happening elsewhere in the energy sector and what's happening with energy prices, what the investment climate looks like. And then the big challenge is how do you integrate all this stuff into the grid as it currently stands, so you're not creating headaches or problems. So that sort of seamless integration of renewables, traditional thermoelectric generation. How do we do more with electricity storage? It's a big area of R&D right now. So we can sort of harmonize generation with demand. There's a lot of activity in that space. But
Ben, this is Jim White. Thanks for the great talk. I just want to follow up on Matt's question. I mean, as you know, it's more than an argument. It's actually a fight between utility companies who would like to regulate and limit, in many ways, local generation, and activists at the local level. I mean, I'm very curious as to what you, as someone who studies this, what do you think is the fair way forward for generating solar at a local level, or should we be generating it at a local level?
Yeah, it's fantastic, fantastic question, and I have to say, not one. I mean, so I spend a lot of time thinking about why these things don't happen, in terms of sort of what has to happen to sort of move past those hurdles. It's a tricky one. It's a tricky one, particularly with the sort of current investments in capital stock that we made. So you sort of understand why the private sector wants to protect their turf, wants to protect their investments, and would be averse to inviting competition into their own sort of service area, particularly when that could create some headaches in terms of the sort of integration problem, to the extent that that's actually a real problem. So I think probably what you're going to have to see, I think you're going to see how this stuff often moves forward in the U.S. by fits and starts, and early adopters in certain regions, not to mention any names on the West Coast, for example, that are creating the sort of policy and economic incentives that reduce the barriers to entry for these sort of small-scale operators for rooftop solar, that essentially drive the bigger utilities to remove barriers and sort of force them to enable those types of technologies to come online. And then through that type of sort of policy experimentation, then it starts to spread into other markets. Yeah, it's going to be a messy landscape for the energy sector for some time. But from a free market perspective, it's hard to argue that people shouldn't be allowed to make their own investments to generate their own electricity on their own property. So we'll see which of those arguments plays out in different markets.
We're running just a few minutes over, but I've just one question, and then we can break, and we'll bring both Ben and Jennifer Francis back for question and answer period from the internet audience, and also any of you else in the room who want to hang out. You can ask those questions as well. Ben, my question was that I've heard over the last couple of years that if everybody in the country bought an electric car, and maybe 2 electric cars because we're 2-car families, that we wouldn't have enough power to charge them. Mm-hmm. Is that true?
So I don't know if that statistic's true, but the important point here is electric vehicles are not free energy vehicles, right? So all we're just doing is displacing energy generation from power plants, well, not actually from liquid fuels onto power plants. So we're just plugging in all of our cars into the grid. So yeah, that has a fairly significant, you plug in a few 100 million cars in electricity grid, and that's energy driving them. That's a fairly big power suck on the electricity grid. And so part of the scenarios about the future are to what extent we're going to see that penetration of that technology. And this comes up in the greenhouse emissions debate all the time. And people say, we're moving to electric vehicles. And fine, that's a more efficient technology in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, at least, particularly if you're using natural gas or renewables, and that's where the electricity charging those vehicles comes from. But yeah, there's no free energy out there, so that electricity has to come from somewhere. And essentially, all you're doing is creating this big new electricity market for utilities. And some utilities are, some of the conversations I've had, they're diversifying their thinking, and so they're not just thinking about we're the sort of stationary electricity generator. We want to be in the energy services business, which means yes, generating electricity for households and commercial businesses, but also figuring out how do we make energy services available to, electric vehicle market. Yeah, it's an important point. So thanks.
Okay, that sounds great, Ben. Thanks so much for taking these questions and for your presentation. I did just want to make an announcement just one more time that we'll be coming back in about 10 minutes for those of you online that want to ask questions to Jennifer Francis and also to Ben. So we'll sit them up front here. And just to let everybody know online, you probably know already in the room, there is a blizzard warning in effect right now for the Mid-Atlantic, Washington, D.C., Baltimore area. So that starts at 3 o'clock p.m. tomorrow and goes until 6 a.m. on Sunday. So that's going to be it for now for the next 10 minutes or so. Stick around. We'll have the agenda page up, and then we'll bring Ben and Jennifer back for your questions. Thanks so much. We'll see you shortly.